Ignore the baby. I've recently fallen down the rabbit hole of Junji Ito's works, and as I have done so, I've discovered that he's a very creative mind. Not only that, he is a very talented manga artist, and honestly single-handedly got me into the horror manga genre. One thing I particularly like about Junji Ito is how he's able to take the mundane and twist it to the absurd, subtly making a lot of his stories feel strangely realistic while being out of this world at the same time. What I kind of want to do in this video is, since I've recently finished all of his works, I want to go through them one by one, tell you some of the highlights of each one so that you can decide where you want to start or where you would like to go down this journey through Junji Ito's works. I think that a lot of people will just tell you which one to start with, but a great way to do it is to see what interests you the most, and hopefully this video will help you with that. Now, the way I'm going to format it is I'm going to go through it from my least favorite to my most favorite. It will be subjective. I'll tell you why each of those is my subjective opinion along the way, but keep in mind that you might be the exact opposite, so take the little synopsis I give of each book and decide which one sounds most like you. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and start with my least favorite, which is still good, but my personal least favorite. And that is his most recent work, actually, that came out maybe a month ago, called Censor. Now, Censor follows a girl who stumbles upon a village that's by a volcano that is covered in golden angelic hair. Throughout the book, the hair comes onto our protagonist and she reaches a higher form of enlightenment. Now, while this was still interesting, I did read the whole thing. I kind of felt this one a little bit over the top, and it wasn't as subtle as his other works, so it didn't get to me as much. That being said, if the synopsis interests you and the artwork interests you, give it a shot. It's still pretty good. Now, one thing with this one is it does have a very pretty inside jacket, and the cover, well, I don't like the cover as much as some of the other elements of this book, but a lot of the artwork and the jacket itself on the inside is very pretty. Now, for the next book I want to talk about, that is going to be Junji Ito's Cat Diary, where he follows his two cats, Yan and Mu. Now, these are really cute cats. No. I don't know if I call them that. They're actually kind of creepy sometimes. But what differs about this from other of his works is it's very autobiographical. Throughout the book, you actually get to see questions that the author has answered that have been asked by fans. And you also get to see a little bit of slice of life for Junji Ito with his wife and with his cats and kind of like his home life. So in the sense that if you really get into Junji Ito and you do want to know a little about the author, this is kind of fun because not only is it autobiographical, but it takes more of a comedy approach than a horror approach. So as a fan, this is a great one to read. As someone starting out, if like a comedy horror cat thing sounds good to you, you could definitely pick it up. But I feel like for most people, this would not be the starting place for Junji Ito, but it is great for people who are already in his fan base. So the next one I would like to feature is Frankenstein. So I really liked his work at Frankenstein and I really liked his interpretation of it, but the reason I ranked it a little bit lower is mainly because it's a derivative work. While he does make a nice spin on Frankenstein and the art he employs in it is very interesting and engaging, it is still at the skeleton level of the story, Mary Shelley's story. So while it's a great interpretation, it's not something out of this world that was like mind-blowing to me from Junji Ito, which a lot of his books are. So that put this one a little bit lower while at the same time still being executed fairly well. Now, the Frankenstein section of this book is only actually about the first half. After that, there are other stories that they compile with this for English readers. So when you do purchase Frankenstein, you're also getting a couple other stories as well. One that actually continues on for a while. So if you like short stories that have multiple segments, this book does have one of those. That basically follows a boy who lives by himself in a haunted mansion. His parents basically run around, are not always home. And in this mansion, there is alternate dimensions, and in a lot of those alternate dimensions, he's actually evil. So that was a fun short story, but it wasn't enough to bring it further up. It's solid, and Frankenstein is solid, but it still kind of sits towards the bottom for me. But if that synopsis sounds good to you, you would likely love the short story collection that is also included in Frankenstein. The next one is Venus and the Blind Spot. Now, this is one of his short story collections, so my placement of this versus the other short story collections is kind of subjective, but I put this one at the bottom of those. One really positive thing about this edition, though, that a lot of his other books do not have, is it includes a lot of colored artwork from his most famous books at the beginning. That's really nice to have in any collection. Now, some of the stories that this book features that are interesting is there's one that's called The Human Chair, where there is a man basically stitched into the chair that a woman owns, and he's basically in love with her, and every time she sits down there, you know, a little weird, but very intriguing. The cover of this book is based off of a story called Venus in the Blind Spot, hence the name of the book. And that's basically this woman and is in this like space type club with a bunch of men, and they are being influenced to not be able to see her after they fall in love with her, which is very strange. This one also features one of Junji Ito's most famous short stories, which is The Enigma of Amigara Fault. And this one basically follows a bunch of people who see holes in the earth in the shape of humans. Now, oftentimes when people see this on the news, they recognize one of these holes is in their own shape and feel like they are drawn to the area so that they can go inside of that hole. It's very creepy. Definitely one of his more famous works that has been translated into English, and it is included in this book, so for that, I definitely do recommend this one. It is a pretty solid collection, and the book itself is very beautiful. Moving on, let's talk Fragments of Horror. This is a very solid short story collection by Junji Ito. One thing that many people might actually appreciate about this one that not all books of his have is if you were to take the dust jacket off, which is cool in itself, the book itself is very, very interesting and very, for a lack of a better term, pretty. Anyway, I like it. As it is a short story collection, I probably won't give an in-depth summary of every single one in this book, but I'll tell you 3 that I particularly enjoyed from this one. In one, a couple goes to a fortune teller. The fortune teller tells them they will soon break up, and ends up getting romantically involved with the man in that relationship, which ends in some very interesting ways that I'll let you read to find out about. Another one is a girl who grows up fascinating with dissecting animals, who then, as an adult woman, wishes everyone will dissect her. So that one's really interesting too. The last one that I kind of want to feature from this one is The Whispering Woman. This follows a rich father with a daughter who is unable to make any decisions for herself, even the most minuscule. They hire someone to help her make all those decisions and get through the day, and they form a very strong and eerie attachment. So those are some of my favorites from this book, but there's other ones too. It's a very solid collection. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Next is Dissolving Classroom, which is published by a different publisher, so it's actually a softcover. At least the one I have is. The entire book follows 2 siblings, an older brother and a younger sister. The younger sister is always causing people trouble, and the older brother is always apologizing. Somehow the combo of these 2 siblings leads to almost everyone in their lives. Yeah. The next one I'd like to feature is Remina, which is an entire story, not a short story collection. This follows a scientist who discovers the existence of a new planet and names it after his daughter, as he has the naming rights. Quickly, they discover the planet is heading towards Earth, and the daughter quickly becomes the scapegoat for all of humanity in a post-apocalyptic tale. I really like how absurd this one gets as it grows and builds to a very crazy level that encompasses the entire planet. If you're into those post-apocalyptic style stories, this one would be a great one to pick up. I really enjoyed Shiver, and this one I particularly appreciate the cover because you can see after you read the book what each element of the cover is referring to of the short stories in the book, and that was actually kind of satisfying. Another element that Shiver has besides the stories within it is at the end of each story, or it might be the beginning, there is a sketch from Junji Ito when he was originally making the story with a little bit of an explanation of what got him into making that story. So that's not in all the books, so if you kind of like the behind the scenes approach to looking at an author's work, This does a great job at that. Now, like with the other ones, I'll feature 3 of my favorite stories from this book to just give you a little bit of an idea of what type of stories are in here. The one that it's named after is a story called Shiver, where a boy loses his grandfather to a disease that riddles his grandfather with holes. He tries to figure out what that's about, and it kinda takes him down the path of reading a World War II journal. I'll let you read it from there, but it is the namesake of the book, and a very interesting story. Another one that's in this book, if you were to look at the cover here, is there is a bunch of basically big giant balloons with the faces of everyone on Earth. So one would have your face in this story, for example. And the balloons are going after the people who own that face, basically attacking them. So absurd, but strangely realistic enough that I started feeling a little bit shivery myself. The 3rd story I will feature from this book is called Marionettes, so basically a bunch of puppets. This family is so obsessed with puppets that they decide that they want to become puppets themselves, so they hire servants that will basically control them as if they were a puppet. Anyway, this is a very solid story collection. I recommend it. Getting to my favorite short story collection, Smashed is a masterpiece. It starts strong, featuring a story with bats and blood-sucking. That is very interesting. There's also a very interesting segment of short stories that are combined, I guess, into a little bit larger of a story that is featured in this book, and that is about a family who owns a haunted house that seems very unusually realistic. And then the namesake of this book I'll also mention to you is there is this delicious nectar that you want to eat. But if you get caught eating the nectar, you're smashed. This is a very solid short story collection to start with if you do want to start with short stories. And one of my favorite books by Junji Ito altogether. My next one is one I don't own physically because I read it on my Kindle. The physical book was a little bit too expensive for me, and that is No Longer Human. No Longer Human is actually unique as far as Junji Ito's works go. We basically follow the story of a child who grows up to an adult and his experience with that. He has some antisocial elements to his personality in the way that a sociopath would, at least that's how I interpreted it, and he kind of interprets it as he's not really human and he just clowns around. There are some more serious down-to-earth topics included in this book that aren't really included in the other ones to the same extent, including suicidality. There's a lot of sexuality and it's kind of like a twisted version of it in this book. There's also just a lot of thinking about humanity and thinking, it's much deeper. Politics are included in this book, so as far as Junji Ito's works, it is a very unique one. If you're someone who wants to delve deep and look at some of those higher topics, I don't know if you call them higher, but if you want to look at some of those more serious topics, then this book is a good one, and it's the only one that's really in that genre. As we get into this next section of the video, the works I talk about from here on out are now what I think as Junji Ito's best works. I'm gonna go ahead and pick up Tomie and talk a little bit about this one. This one was basically his first major work and basically his debut into horror manga. And this follows a girl named Tomie that causes a lot of men to fall in love with her and a lot of people to be entranced with her. Now, when they get into this state, they often become murderers, often actually murdering Tomie. But through different methods, she always comes back, even when you feel like she shouldn't be able to. The rhythm to this book is very interesting as it is cyclical in nature and keeps you going through the same process over and over again in a new way that you wouldn't expect to occur. So Tomie, I definitely think, is one of the better books by Junji Ito, so if that synopsis intrigues you, it is not a bad starting place. The next one is Lovesickness, which I actually think I might rank a little bit higher than most people, but that's basically because I like the whole synopsis surrounding the stories in this book, and it just was the right combo for me. Maybe I'm ranking it a little high, but I liked it quite a bit. Now, the first story, which is kind of the main story in this book, is a town that gives off fortunes at crossroads. So basically, if you want your fortune told, you go to a crossroads and you wait for the first person to walk by, and you ask that person, no matter who they are, to give you a fortune. Now, sometimes this works out pretty well if you run into someone nice, but over time they discover this handsome boy, featured on the cover, that frequently gives off pretty bad fortunes, causing people to go into a panic. Now, the main story that I went over is not the entire book. There's a couple short stories at the end, one following a group of crazy siblings who do a seance to bring their parents back, and there's a couple other little ones too. But my favorite one is definitely the featured story in here, which is that crossroads at the town story. And it's just really good. So if you're into that synopsis at all, this is very well executed. Down to the final two. These ones are probably ones that most people would agree with me because they're very famous and very good. One is Gyo. This is a horror, but it also has a little bit of a comedic effect to it too, which is kind of interesting. I kind of like that mix when we have that occurring. Now, what happens at the beginning of the story is we see a couple, and the woman is very sensitive to smell. She spends a lot of time complaining about stenches until there's an actual stench that her partner also agrees with her is pretty nasty. And shortly after that, we see a fish on land with legs. Now, it starts pretty slow and gets pretty extreme, a little bit out of this world, a little bit absurd, but the gradual progression of how absurd the story is was something that I particularly really liked, and I liked where it got to at the end, and it was just very masterfully done. If you like the combination of absurd, dark comedy with horror, I think this would definitely be the right place to start for you. Now finally, we have my introduction to Junji Ito, which was Uzumaki. Now, I think I made an amazing choice in starting here, as this is a very, very good story, and it is done so well through his artwork. Now, as the title suggests, this book is a horror book following the spiral. Yes, the shape. So, before I read this book, I couldn't really imagine a world where I would be scared or kind of eerily spooked out by a shape, but this one did a great job doing that. It starts very, very subtle in this town where a couple of our main characters begins to see shapes of spirals in places where you'd expect to see them. The shell of a snail. If you were to drop something into a lake, obviously there'd be that little ripple. Places where you expect to see spirals, and then throughout the book, it gets more absurd, more ridiculous as we start seeing spirals where there shouldn't be, which leads to a lot of horrific events that encompass the entire town. So if you like to see subtly a shape take over a book and actually scare you, basically the shape being the main protagonist, okay, there's protagonists, but it's very present. This is a great place to start. I think that if you don't know where to start based on the synopsis, this is a good place to start by default. So that's the order of Junji Ito books for me. There's also this Twisted Visions book. This isn't really a book, this is just a collection of artwork, so if you're more into art collecting, this is a great thing to add to your collection as well. It has a lot of beautiful imagery in it. If you're already a fan of Junji Ito, like I am, let me know which one's your favorite and why. Where do you think people should start on their journey? And did I miss any that are available in English that I should still pick up? Have a great day, and hopefully I'll see you later.